Hey, good morning, everybody. It's a beautiful Sunday morning in Colorado Springs, Colorado. I'm Ted Haggard from St. James Church here in Colorado Springs. And today we are going to be studying Joshua, the 6th chapter. And that's where the account for the fall of Jericho is recorded in the Bible. All right. So I read out of the New Living Translation. And so if you can follow along, that'd be great. If you don't have a New Living Translation, the scriptures will be at the bottom of the screen here. All right, here it says, "Now the gates of Jericho were tightly shut because the people were afraid of the Israelites. No one was allowed to go in or out. But the Lord said to Joshua, I have given you Jericho." Now that's what will happen with every one of you as you enter into ministry. The Lord will give you some confidence in some area. And with that confidence, then you can pursue. It doesn't mean there won't be a fight, but it means you'll ultimately win. Here it says, "I have given you Jericho, its king, and all its strong warriors. You and your fighting men should march around the town once a day for 6 days." Okay, so they were in Jericho. They were already scared. They already had the gates closed tight. Nobody was allowed to go in and out. And then the slow process begins. Every day, Israel walks around Jericho. Now, for those of you that have been to Jericho, you know the approximate size of that. It wasn't a huge city to walk around, but it was quite a walk. And so they were doing that once a day. This was psychological warfare. In addition to obedience to God, it had those people on edge. 7 priests will walk ahead of the ark, each carrying a ram's horn. On the 7th day, you are to march around the town 7 times with the priest blowing the horns. When you hear the priest give one long blast on the ram's horns, have all the people shout as loud as they can. Then the walls of the town will collapse and the people can charge straight into the town. So, all right, not only are they scaring the people horribly, but they have a supernatural intervention getting ready to happen. And those walls, if you've been there, and some of you have, I know, you know that it's in a desert kind of sandy area. So those walls it's not like the walls the Romans built, but those walls with a series of events, they could have come down. And then you add the supernatural power to it, and those things come down. They did have boulders on them. You can go there and you can actually see the fallen wall. They had to excavate it some, but you can see it. Okay, so here God gives this promise. He gives this assurance. And as soon as God gives that kind of assurance, man, oh man, you can accomplish so many things. So, and by the way, if you think God has given you assurance and it doesn't happen, that was your imagination. It wasn't God. Okay. All right. So Joshua called together the priests and said, "Take up the ark of the Lord's covenant," and assigned 7 priests to walk in front of it, each carrying a ram's horn. Then he gave orders to the people, "March around the town, and the armed men will lead the way in front of the ark of the Lord." So notice here, trust. Here, the idea, Joshua trusts the Lord because he has experience. He's figured out what the Lord's voice is in contrast to his own thoughts or his own desires or his own imaginations. Then when Joshua talks to the people, they trust him as well. All right. And the reason they trust him is because what he has said and the way he has stood and the way the miracles have happened, they know he's a man of God and that they can trust him. All right. So in verse 8, it says, "After Joshua spoke to the people, the 7 priests with the ram's horns started marching in the presence of the Lord, blowing the horns as they marched. And the ark of the Lord's covenant followed behind them. Some of the armed men marched in front of the priests with the horns and some behind the ark, with the priests continually blowing the horns. Do not shout. Do not even talk, Joshua commanded. Not a single word from any of you until I tell you to shout. Now, think about this. This is very interesting because if you have people in a meeting or you have people that are doing something, but they just stay silent, it's a whole different communication than if you have people strolling with their friends talking. All right. I was in an airplane one time flying to Istanbul. And as we were approaching that area, we started circling one of the big bodies of water there. And we started dumping fuel. And as you know, when you go into that part of the world, anything can happen. And so I was there with one of my associates, Ross Parsley. We were side by side in the airplane. And the most interesting thing happened. In all the movies, when that kind of thing starts to happen, people scream or people cry or people do that kind of thing. That's for the movies. Okay. What everybody did in this plane is they went dead silent. There wasn't a sound because we all knew we were in the area that was dangerous. We all knew there was political tension there. We all knew a variety of military entities have the power to shoot down a commercial airliner. They're easy to do. And so everything went quiet. And Ross and I looked at one another and we thought, and we talked about this later, we thought, this may be the last thing we ever do. But we didn't say anything at that time. They landed the plane, not in Istanbul, but a different city. They took us into a room. They kept us there for a few hours. Then they let us go. Nobody ever said a word. And see, here, when he has the people, when he says, march around the town, or when he says, not a single word from any of you until I tell you to shout. That was a terrifying series of events for the people inside of Jericho. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priest again carried the ark of the Lord. The 7 priests with the ram's horns marched in front of the ark of the Lord, blowing their horns. Again, the armed men marched both in front of the priests with the horns and behind the ark of the Lord. All this time, the priests were blowing their horns. On the second day, they again marched around the town once and returned to camp. They followed this pattern for 6 days. On the 7th day, the Israelites got up at dawn and marched around the town as they had done before. But this time, they went around the town 7 times. The 7th time around, as the priest sounded the long blast on their horns, Joshua commanded the people, shout, for the Lord has given you the town. Jericho and everything in it must be completely destroyed. As an offering to the Lord, only Rahab the prostitute. Now think about that when you think about redemption. Hey, I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Redeeming Love. Redeeming Love is the Old Testament story of the prophet being ordered to display the love of God by marrying a prostitute. Here in this siege, here only Rahab the prostitute and the others in her house are being spared, for she protected our spies. Isn't that interesting? All right. Do not take any. Oh, by the way, my wife loves this movie, Redeeming Love. And some of her girlfriends, they all have been to see it. They all talk about it, all that kind of thing. It's a little risque for me, but it communicates the love of God. I'm fine with that. And people just love it. We have a colonel in our church, a retired full bird colonel, and he absolutely loves it. He's a redemption guy. And I would encourage you to go, but we've noticed lots of people here in town won't go to it because it's too risque. Just like, how many leaders would you trust if the leader said, hey, the Lord wants us to not have anything to do with this group of people except the prostitutes? Yeah. Okay, so do not take any of the things set apart for destruction, or you yourselves will be completely destroyed, and you will bring trouble on the camp of Israel. Everything made from silver, gold, bronze, and iron is sacred to the Lord and must be brought into his treasury. Now, this is an interesting point, because when you and I mess up, we bring trouble to the church. We bring trouble to our friends. And so obedience is just so important for every one of us. When the Lord heard the sound of the ram's horn, when the people heard the sound of the ram's horn, they shouted as loud as they could. Suddenly, the walls of Jericho collapsed. That will happen as you walk in obedience to the Lord. Now, it doesn't mean you'll always understand it. However, you'll find a beautiful, beautiful result at the end of all of that confusion and what appears to be nonsense. And the Israelites charged straight into the town and captured it. They completely destroyed everything in it with their swords, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, goats, and donkeys. So, they thought, oh, we need this stuff. This is great. But the Lord said no. Meanwhile, Joshua said to the two spies, keep your promise, go to the prostitute's house and bring her out along with her family. Now, everybody, it's very important that we hear this important part about obedience to the Lord and how violent this was. These people were enemies of Israel. Okay, that's what you and I have to do with the enemies of our lives. I mean, the spiritual enemies of our lives. We've got to be brutal with it, ruthless with it. And I know our culture right now says we need to accept people like they are. And if people say they're born that way, well, we need to be kind. Well, here's the bottom line. We were all born in sin. And for any of us to grow in the Lord, we have to deny ourselves and take up the cross and follow him. And most of the time, that'll be a joy. Some of the time, that'll be very challenging. Okay, the men who had been spies went in and brought out Rahab, her father, mother, brothers, and all the other relatives who were with her. Okay, you see what happened? You see what happened? He says, you obey me, or it's going to hurt the entirety of Israel. Then Rahab responded to the Lord, and it saved her whole family. This is a huge point. Then the Israelites burned the town and everything in it. Only the things made from silver, gold, bronze, and iron were kept for the treasury of the Lord's house. So notice, it's the treasury of the Lord's house, not their own personal houses. So Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute and her relatives who were with her in the house because she had hidden the spies Joshua sent to Jericho, and she lives among the Israelites to this day. Okay, let me make one big point about this, and then let's go. All right. Here, when we see the redemption that Rahab enjoyed, and when we see the Israelites burning the town and everything in it, and then the things that wouldn't burn were kept for the treasury of the Lord's house. Okay, that emphasizes the Lord's house. We are Americans. All right, most of you listening are Americans. So we just so naturally rebel. Okay, we're Americans, so we were birthed in fighting for our freedom from England. Most of you listening to this morning are Protestants. So we were birthed spiritually out of fighting a really conflicting battle in Luther's era so that we could have the Protestant church. Okay, here's what we've noticed. In Europe, some of the countries became Protestant. In Europe, other countries stayed Catholic. Okay, now we're 400 or 500 years later. All right, the countries that became Protestant are now secular. The countries that stayed Catholic are Catholic. Now, why? It's because Catholicism builds in their people the importance of the church, where Protestantism builds in our lives our own desires. We get saved if we want to. It's a personal experience. and it may or may not involve a church. And so we go through our lives here with a lot of things on radio and TV, a lot of things so that we can have our spiritual lives without being part of the church. I would say that's going to be a fatal flaw, and that is going to take us in the wrong direction unless every one of us decides the church is vitally important. And most of you that are listening to this have never been in a country where there are no churches. That's where we're headed in Protestantism. And the churches that were huge in the 80s most of them are gone now. Or most of the Protestant churches are gone now. And so it's going to be very interesting. I'm going to be dead when all this transpires, but I'll be in heaven by then. But this next generation is going to have to decide if their own personal happiness is their God, or if when they come to Christ, they become a member of the church. By the way, when you're water baptized, that is the physical demonstration that you're now part of the church. And then your loyalty to make sure that thing happens and grows is not going to be on anybody's responsibility but ours. And so anyway, take that for what it's worth. Here it is it's pretty strong here in Joshua 6 about how if we mess up, we can hurt the whole group. If you're out in the world and you come to Christ, you will be redeemed, and things are saved for the treasury of the Lord's house. Everything else is supposed to be destroyed. So this really isn't so much about us. This really is an awful lot about God's kingdom. Okay, enough of that. All right, listen, you have a wonderful week. You can read the rest of the chapter. I look forward to seeing you again next week. Hey, God bless you.